Right, let's get cracking. So, I'd like to welcome our wonderful panelists this evening. We have Arvinder Ubhi from Ellis Porter, who is our immigration expert. Welcome. And then we have Kirsty Lowe, who is VP of Finance at Perlego, which is an international education SaaS platform. Is that the right description?
I don't know if those are the words we ever kind of used for ourselves, but we're basically a digital subscription to textbooks. So think of us as an online library.
Fantastic, brilliant. And then we have Anthony Rose, who is the founder and CEO at Seedlegals, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And I would just like to give you guys an opportunity to intro yourselves and what your companies do. So take it away, Arvinder.
Thank you for everyone. Very nice to meet you. So Ellis Porter is a US immigration law firm. We are headquartered out of Detroit, Michigan. We have several offices there with about 350 employees throughout the US. I myself am a US licensed lawyer. I lived and worked in North America for over a decade. And then in 2019, moved back to London and launched our UK office. And out of our UK office, we work predominantly with UK, European headquartered companies or founders who are looking to expand into the US market. We help navigate their immigration process and then scale with them as they develop their immigration strategy there.
Amazing. Thanks very much. And Kirsty, how would you describe your role and a bit more about Perlego and the story?
Hi, so I'm Kirsty. I'm the VP Finance at Perlego. As I mentioned, we're a digital library. So effectively, we offer textbooks through our platform, both directly to students and institutions, which is an interesting business model where you effectively have almost two within one. We are a UK group with a US subsidiary, which I inherited shortly after I joined. So had all the joys of dealing with consequences without necessarily having made the decisions around that. My role is quite broad and covers everything from sort of the finance operations, legal and compliance side of things.
Amazing. It sounds like you were absolutely delighted to inherit that structure. Great. And then Anthony, can you tell us a bit about Seedlegals and your story in the US as well?
Yes, so hello. So, Seedlegals, 160-person company now. We've got about 50,000 UK companies on the platform. A good fraction of UK startups are on Seedlegals, which is fantastic. But for our growth, obviously, we need to look further afield. And so the US, we're in France, we're in Ireland as well. But the big banana is the US. But the US is fraught with all sorts of, things. It's not one country, it's 50 states. Fortunately, most startups are registered in Delaware, but no one actually lives in Delaware. So as we began expanding in the US, there were two things. One, we had to create a US product, but two, we needed to navigate ourselves, setting up a US subsidiary, the tax, the immigration, the payroll, and all the others. And one of the things I personally love doing is finding something that's quite difficult that people spend a lot of time on and productizing it. So at Seedlegals, we can productize some things, the Delaware flip, fundraising, the funding round, and so on in the US. But in particular, we're also partnering with the companies that do the things that we can't do. So if you want to move to the US, you're going to talk to this guy about immigration. And if you want to do payroll, then these ones. And if you want banking, of course, Wise. So to make all the pieces that you need for US expansion, whether you want to fundraise from US investors or just do business in the US or move to the US, to provide, all the stuff that you didn't know and you'd search the internet for or pay vast amounts to US lawyers for, much easier and much simpler.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I guess it makes sense for us to start out with your experience of the US market as it currently is. There have been a lot of changes on the immigration front. I'm sure we all know about the changes to visa regimes. How are you seeing that impact UK companies, Arvinder?
So the big elephant in the room is that immigration is tough right now. I think everyone's probably seen news articles. It is real. And so we are not trying to hide behind the fact that, there have been changes. Immigration is more difficult than it has been in prior years. There are more challenges. There's obstacles that pop up literally without any notice. And we're scrambling around to try and help our clients navigate that process. But there is still a formula to it. The immigration laws generally haven't changed since the 1970s. And so we use our wealth of experience to help navigate that process as best we can. And what we're recommending to all of our clients is speak to us early and often, right? So if you are looking to expand to the US, it is not as easy as moving to some other countries where they have short-term work permits. You can apply at the border. You can't do that in the US. And they are getting quite granular. So we're telling clients now, be really mindful about your social media, right? So don't post your head of US operations or VP of sales in the US and change your location from London to San Francisco. Because when you're in front of a Customs and Border Protection officer after an 11-hour flight and you're saying, I'm only coming for meetings, but your last post on Instagram was can't wait to work in the US for 2 months, it's really hard to refute that fact. And your job title is now head of VP, VP of operations in the US, and you've got a US phone number. So really small things have big impacts, I think, now.
Mm-hmm. And with the obviously we've got the different visas, and there's now a lot more money being charged per company for visas. Is that something that we're seeing slowing down expansion to the US from the UK?
So I think it's very similar to what we saw during the pandemic. There are some companies and founders who the US is the biggest market, and regardless of what happens, their clients, the investors want them there, and they will go through whatever they need to get there. And that's still the large pool of customers. We have some who are just terrified by what may or may not happen, and so they're taking a wait and see approach. I would say that's a very small proportion of clients. And then some who just say, I'm just not going to touch it right now.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to go into the US and being put off by it. But most clients and companies that we're seeing, they understand that it's going to take a little bit more time. There may be some instability. There may be some decisions that don't go their way. And it's not a decision against them. It's just the current climate right now.
Mm-hmm.
But those companies where their products and services are still hitting hard in the US, they're going to go there because the economy is there, the market's there, and money's there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you're a fintech the size of Wise, you're thinking about sort of US expansion because of the value of the market and the size of the market. And obviously we're expanding our teams on the ground there. And I think that's possibly, one of the intending consequences of, the changes that have happened. So Kirsty, you talked about sort of inheriting a structure. Have you thought about the Delaware flip? Have you thought about sort of, changing the way the company functions in order to accommodate your expansion into the US market?
So whilst it isn't what I would have picked, we've actually kind of managed to work the structure for us as it stands. Kind of we expanded into the US, I guess, touching on what you said, as many people do, both for the kind of purchasing power and also the scale of the market. And then particularly in the education space, the US is a market which puts a very high value on education. It's something that they're willing to spend quite heavily on. It doesn't help that a lot of them don't read as much, which kind of supports the economics of going into the market. But all in all, it made it kind of quite attractive. And then in terms of sort of timing for us as well, we already had kind of a strong product market fit in the UK. And once we acquired effectively the content necessary to enter the US market, we didn't necessarily approach it from the perspective of kind of how do you get all your ducks in a row before you go in, which is quite often the pitfall. But actually, how can we get in as fast as possible?
Right.
And I think, one of the mistakes we made was confusing sort of actually the necessity of an entity in order to do that, when actually it's perfectly feasible to go and validate and be a little more intentional with your approach without actually necessarily needing an entity to kind of get off the ground, and you can enter the market without having to have everything in if you are intentional in that sense. And so, I mean, I remember once someone describing me going into the US market as clowns in a minefield, and it was just kind of a matter of time before you stepped in something. And so actually kind of the main learning for us is kind of, again, just being a lot more intentional with how we're approaching it. And again, it's not just a country and one market. It's almost 50 little countries with slightly different rules and quite strong consequences if you overstep those very firm boundaries, both from a legal, a tax, a nexus, and employment perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting, that insight that you're not just going into one country, you're going into, 50 smaller markets, with their own challenges and their own requirements. And really interesting as well. I mean, you must deal with a lot of IP. You know, that's probably sort of, you know, the main kind of like driver behind the content on the platform. I need to disclose here that Kirsty is actually a Wise Business customer. She didn't have to set up a US entity because she set up some US account details with us and is able to function from a finance perspective like a local US company using Wise Business. But yeah, I mean, how have you found kind of purchasing in, you know, other currencies? Is that part of your kind of like day-to-day in terms of treasury, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we operate in 190 plus countries because of both the D2C and the B2B side of the business. It means we have over 10 currencies that we accept payment in. I have over time tried to cull that list slightly to avoid certain ones. But it does create a lot of complexity, both from being able to manage the payment inflows and also the outflows and all the costs associated with that. So our stack revolves around kind of optimizing that. We are a Wise customer, and we have found that really valuable for having the kind of our core functional currency accounts in terms of pounds, euros, and dollars, which allow us to sort of have that not the physical entity, but kind of the bank presence, which means that we can accept in those currencies from also PSPs as well as individual providers, and also make payments in those in quite a hassle-free way, which is quite a core part of our sort of treasury and operational day-to-day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And then Anthony, I wanted to pick up on that point there about you don't necessarily need to set up an entity. How do you find that sort of operating in the US and now working with US startups?
It's a great question. I think that's key to the whole US expansion. So I put it in a few levels. So let's go. Level one is just enable your website for, you know, the US, and you do some US SEO and you buy some Google Pay. No one leaves the country, you know, setting up, and you just enable it in the US. That's great. Your cost is zero to do it. Level two is you now want to hire people in the US. So if they're consultants or contractors, you can hire them from the UK company into the US, no need for Delaware or other. Level three is you now want to set up a US entity as a subsidiary of your UK company, which is exactly what we do at Seedlegals. So why do you want to do that? It's because US folks are litigious. So you ideally want to have your US operation through a US company, so quarantines any issues. Number two, you ideally don't want to create a tax entity for presence, and by creating a C Corp in the US, you can quarantine that as well. And number three, if you want to employ people in the US, you must never employ them from your UK company in the US as an employee, or you create an unwanted tax presence. So all of these mean you're going to create a US company. And the good news is you can do this like literally for $500, which is, you know, only a little bit more than Companies House these days. So I think the future is just to make a Delaware company. But anyway, so level three is US subsidiary, $449. You can make it this evening on Seedlegals, super easy. Level four is you now want to raise investment from US investors. And ideally, you're going to get them to invest in your UK company, because why would you go to any extra trouble? But US investors generally want a Delaware C corporation for a few reasons. One, they're familiar with the law. Two, they, in the same way we've got SEIS and EIS here, they've got something called QSBS, Qualified Small Business Stock. Not as good, but if they're investing in a C corporation, and they keep their shares for 5 years, they pay no federal capital gains tax up to the higher of $15 million or 10x their investment. So this drives the decisioning for US investors to prefer to invest in a C corporation. It doesn't have to be Delaware. And the number three is, you know, for US folks, the rest of the world doesn't really exist. It's a scary place. And so they're worried about investing outside because there are all sorts of tax things they don't know about. And there's passive foreign income if your company makes money from other things and they get taxed, and they've got other forms. So if you're a Delaware company and they're seeing all these other founders coming their way and you're a Delaware company as well, you've just removed a lot of friction. So once you understand these different levels, you can start by just going, hey, I'll just turn on my platform in the US and see. And then, okay, I'm going to hire a few people, make a subsidiary, or I want to fundraise. And then lastly, of course, you know, particularly if you are investing or if you are raising from US investors, or you want to enter the US, common mistake I hear is that your first US hire is a very expensive marketing person because you need to do marketing. And then it turns out the only thing they can market is themselves. So why? Because they've dialed it up to 11 US style. Everything's awesome. You think they're amazing because you compare it to the modest English equivalent in your team. And it turns out they're all like that in the US. And you've just,
Apologies to any American people here, by the way.
and you now, hired someone for $250,000 or $300,000 a year, and you're pre-product market fit, and it's not. So the wisdom is the CEO should get his or her butt on a plane and go to the US, which is what I do, and I spend sort of roughly half my time in New York now. So I do want to cover one more thing, which is, oddly, when I post, most things, Seedlegals, SEIS, and this, they're completely factual. Nobody writes going, I hate SEIS or something. But I post about Delaware Flip, and occasionally people go, it's insane. I would never do business with the US. I would refuse to go to the US. It's a, ice wasteland. And it's like, okay, that's weird, because I spend time in New York. It's really, really nice. I like bagels, I like the events. I don't see anything wrong. Anyway, but now, so here there's a fairly wide-held view about Trump and the pictures of ICE and stuff like that. But when you get to the US and you speak to people in the US, they go, how can you live in the UK? It's a prison system. You get arrested for tweeting. It's insane. How can it's you're in a prison. And so people perceive that, generally every time I go on LinkedIn or Twitter, I don't fear the police will knock on my door. And maybe it's because I mostly talk about SEIS. But the perception is the opposite in the US. And actually, I really do advise just get on a plane, go to New York, spend a week in New York, go to at least 3 in-person meetings per day, and then decide that's your basis for deciding your US expansion.
Amazing. That's very comprehensive, but also just so many nuggets there for people to take away. Arvinder, I have a question for you about the most common reasons why companies reach out to you looking to expand their businesses stateside. As we heard from Anthony, there are some concerns at the moment, reservations. There are, several blockers as well, just in terms of regulation, things that Kirsty mentioned. Is it investment? Is it team growth? What's the main driver?
Money.
Okay.
It's pretty simple. Either they're selling their products or services and the market's just significantly larger than the UK and Europe combined, or they're looking for investment. And that's going to be the driver. And the companies that are already selling their goods or services in the US and want to make that expansion are the ones that typically will stick it out, and they'll be the most successful there.
Right. And there are different expectations that come with raising in the US versus the UK. Typically I was reading the other day that, the average sort of investment from a US VC is $5 million. In the UK, it's 2 million. But there is an expectation that with that 5 million, you're going to go really hard and really fast. Whereas with the UK or in Europe, there's an expectation that actually you will go for sustainable growth. You will figure out what works, and you will use that over a longer time period. How do you guys, Kirsty, are you fundraising, or have you been sort of through a couple of rounds?
Yeah, so we're currently, we did a B+ bridge.
Amazing.
Last year. So we did our Series B, was kind of our main round back in 2022. We actually have predominantly taken on UK and European investment. In the last round, we did look at investment on both sides of the pond and had kind of actually quite a similar to what you're saying, but the market has also shifted quite dramatically, and we found on both sides it was slightly toned down in terms of the expectations of what they were prioritizing in terms of the investment. And go back a few years before, and the money for growth at all costs was more of an acceptable model that people were willing to fund, whereas now there was a much heavier emphasis on both, to a larger degree in the UK and Europe, on actually sustainable unit economics and what does this look like at scale as in a business as a whole, not just your sort of top line growth.
Yeah. And have you found that a more comfortable way to work? I guess, as VP of Finance, you're probably kind of trying to map out the roadmap very carefully. Are you more comfortable with that than the kind of like growth at any cost model?
My role is somewhat protected against the growth at all cost model. So yes, it kind of having that balance also kind of helps keep sort of the business and certain more proactive individuals within the business in check and kind of aligned to actually what is something we can genuinely achieve, particularly kind of with the market dynamics we see today, where, you know, across the board, we're a subscription business, the cost of living and also general kind of FX impacts with having a lot of your business in the US are quite significant. How do we make this something which is scalable rather than just surface level scalable?
Yeah, absolutely. And Anthony, is that what you're seeing when you speak to startups?
Well, I think my starting point is to provide the tools that give you the choice of the best way to grow your business rather than pushing in any direction. But I think what's really interesting when founders come to me saying, you know, UK, I'm talking to investors, it's a bit meh. Should I, you know, go find US investors? And the first question is to understand whether the investors are the problem or your pitch deck or business model is the problem. So you're getting, you know, mere input from VCs, and then you look at the pitch deck, and it's actually just not that compelling. And if you go to US investors, you may well find exactly the same thing. It may be that, you know, the US has a higher risk reward profile than the UK, but the trick is to discover whether it's you or the investor that's the problem. The other thing is when you are looking and talking to US investors, you're competing with everyone else coming to this investor who's based in the US that's servicing the US market. So, you know, we tend to get a lot of inbounds from VCs, many in the US, and occasionally I'd take a call with them and it becomes quite obvious. I mean, this is at sort of Series A/B stage. Becomes quite obvious that if you're a UK company, we'll invest as a UK company based on UK metrics. But if you tell me that you're in the US as well, we're now going to treat you as a US company. So call us back when you've got, you know, X amount of traction in the US. But it's a bit more difficult to be a US focused company without traction yet. So you need to be careful when you position yourself about certainly, you know, that's separating investment from market size. But if you want to play with US investors, you need to show US ambition and US market because that's what you're competing with.
Yeah, really interesting. So it's not just, you know, the money or the growth, it's actually market fit as well for the US. It's really interesting. It's kind of, it relates to what you were saying there as well. It's they're looking for very specific things now. Fantastic. And then Arvinder, like when is the right time for, you know, a UK or Europe-based startup to consider expanding into the US? Do you have a view on that?
3 months ago, always 3 months.
Yeah, inevitably we always have calls with clients and they always say I need to be in the US 3 weeks ago, and that's an impossible endeavor. But it's normally your business will tell you, the market will tell you. So most of our clients who are really successful and able to stay in the US and grow are those that have been selling their goods or services there for probably 6 to 12 months already. They've already got really good traction. They've got some existing clients in the US. They are typically the ones that are going to be able to make it work there.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. And Anthony, you know, you have just expanded to the US. I say just, it was last year, right? What kind of drove that decision?
So we've been thinking for ages US, but every time, you know, it's probably going through the same thought process. Well, it's lots of states. It's not one, you know, one state. Actually, for startups, it's always Delaware, so that makes it simpler. They're litigious. We don't understand that the legal freedom to operate is different to the UK. So we had all these reasons to procrastinate, and eventually went, you know what? And I think for me, the biggest thing is I just didn't know what the product proposition was. You know, in the UK, we've got a very specific and hopefully successful product proposition around startups, SEIS, and so on. We know the competition, and the US is very different with players like Carter, not really SEIS, extremely expensive lawyers, and then YC safes, you know, you download on the internet. And so for us, creating a product proposition that I felt comfortable with that we could go and sell. I think the other thing is, you know that you should always try a prototype quickly, see what works, and then iterate. And the question is how much effort, I mean, given it's legals, you can't go, here's my MVP legal funding round. It has to work and be supported and so on. So there's a bigger amount of development that needs to be done. But finally, we thought, you know what, we're going to take the US bet. And you're going to hear from us in a few weeks' time that we're also about to launch Seedlegals Boost, which is connecting startups with investors. I haven't told anyone else yet. So we're also making a big bet on the investor matchmaking space, which will be super interesting.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
That is very exciting. Brilliant. And Kirsty, Perlego has not invested massively in boots on the ground in a team in the US. What are the strategic trade-offs there in terms of managing US expansion remotely?
Well, I think one of the benefits nowadays, and kind of alluding to the sort of level entry points, is kind of the scale that you can actually achieve without having to physically be present. And that's driven by kind of the infrastructure available. Can you get your, house in order, etc. Then for us with that product side, because we are a digital led product, there's a relatively low barrier to entry. We're not trying to follow a new legal regime. And so kind of the compliance side of it is slightly more broad, which means we were in a strong position to actually validate without having to make that commitment. To the kind of point, I guess, of building traction as well, we launched first with the D2C side of our business, where we were already seeing that organic growth. So how could we build on that and really double down before we started actually pushing more on the B2B side? Mm-hmm. So the trade-offs we're currently making, and again, it's not a one-off decision. It's a constant assessment of what worked for us when 10% of our revenue is coming from the US is definitely not the same thing as when 50% of our revenue is coming from the US. So particularly on the B2B side, the decision we're now making is, okay, well, actually do those boots on the ground make more of an impact from, a cultural way of sales is extremely different. We have done the example that was given of the big personality hire and kind of, that not working out.
It didn't work.
Did not work. But also just how they do business, there is an element as well of they want to know, they don't even really care where or why, that you have people there. That there is a cultural element of kind of that side of the sales in the US as well. So we're starting to see some of those trade-offs tip towards actually we probably do want to look that way. But even then, it doesn't necessarily mean that we want to kind of fully commit to a physical presence. Up to now, we've used employees of record to avoid the kind of situation of having our UK entity employ. And we've also, again, been quite intentional with the states where we put people, because you can very quickly build up a whole bunch of nexus that you didn't know existed by having people there. Or someone tells you, oh, by the way, I'm just moving to Texas. And what they don't realize is there are significant consequences to that.
Right. Okay. And Arvinder, I imagine that you are familiar with the consequences of this. Kirsty mentioned employer of record. What are the advantages and perhaps disadvantages there as well?
Yeah. So from an ease and ability to just hire in the US, employer of record makes sense for a lot of companies. And we have a lot of clients who will use that initially. From an immigration perspective, it's not going to work. So if you're looking to have the CEO, exec team go out to the US and operate there, you cannot have an employer of record sponsor those individuals for work permits. And so they would need to be directly hired. But we have a large number of clients who will use an employer of record initially. To Anthony and Chris' point, the issues are real with hiring in the US. And we found that most of the clients who succeed in the US, it's because they've transferred or implanted some of their key individuals, particularly at the executive founder level, who know the product, they know the culture, they know the values of the company, and they're able to distill them to that US team as they grow it out and build out the company. And then normally, if you're not used to operating or hiring in the US, it's eye-watering how much individuals make, even outside of the big cities. It's mind-boggling, but that's just the market that you're going to enter into.
Yeah, absolutely. We heard this a lot from Gradient Labs, who are a Wise Business customer, and they recently raised 13 million Series A. And they said that even with that, they probably didn't want to hire a head of marketing in the US because the salary was just taking so much of that investment that it wasn't worth it. So they were operating from the UK, and now they're doing their US expansion in a slightly more kind of sustainable way. Anthony, have you hired out in the US yet?
Yeah, so I've got a small number of teams in the US. Some of them are from the UK, but I learned very quickly I'm never going to hire a software developer in New York because it's like $250,000 or more. I met someone at an event. He was saying, well, I'm not sure. I've got a few job offers on the table. I'm not sure which. I said, what amount you talking? Oh, like $400,000. It's like, okay, never going to do that. Raise money in the US, hire people in the UK. But to pick up on the point about one of the things I learned and my colleagues in the UK colleagues in New York learned is Americans like your company to be American. So you have to exorcise everything that's not American from the website. You know, team, US website, there must not be the word pound or anything on it. Remove the Millennium Bridge that was nice, or the Shard. It needs to be a picture of New York. And then, you know, my own LinkedIn, I changed to New York instead of London because people would meet you at an event and go, hey, that's great. And they look, oh, you're from London. It's like, no. And every time I think of Arvi when I go through US customs. So maybe I change it. Maybe I change it back to London. So it has the entire proposition needs to feel entirely American. And if I go, you know, we've got 50,000 UK startups on the platform or founders, they go, so what? You know, how many Americans do you have? So you have to internationalize that. That's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, you know, what we see from Wise Business customers who have done precisely this, they're based in the UK or they're based in Europe, and they've either fundraised in the US or they have expanded into the US. They're telling us that they're using Wise to pay payroll for, you know, people based in the US that they have hired in the US, just because it's actually cheaper to hire. It's an interesting one. They've hired in the US, so they're paying salaries, albeit mostly if they're startups, entry-level salaries. But even then, they're saying that actually there's a lot of cost that surrounds like the visa process. How do you help clients to manage that?
So another thing that we found, just before I jump into that, with employer of records is benefits is a huge thing in the US, right? So less so in the UK, but employees will look for a benefits package. And as a small company, it's very hard to get competitive benefits. So if you're trying to attract top talent in the US, using an employer of record can help because they're able to get group benefits and other things. So again, that's something that not everyone recognizes or places an importance on, particularly if you've operated in the UK, where we have a lot of nationalized processes in place. In terms of navigating the expense, it always starts with what are your goals as an individual talking to me today, and what are the goals of the company? Is the focus to get you as a founder out to the US to be able to scale and grow the business? Are you going to be operating out there intermittently, so you're going every 2 or 3 weeks and you're starting to build a team? Or is it that you need to be there, but you also need 36 people from the UK or France, Germany, or Spain to be able to go out there too and build the company? They will have very different immigration strategies and different costs aligned with them. And so anytime we're talking with clients, those are the initial aspects. It's, we all know you want to work in the US, but what's the main focus? Is it you? Is it speed? Is it a team? And then how can we maximize getting the best visa that has the most bang for your buck, and it's going to give you the most value for what you need then? And so, you know, we've had cases where companies look very similar, and we've utilized like an O1 visa because really it was just the founder that needed to be in the US. And other times we've worked with clients and we said, look, the E2 investor visa is going to be the best route because it's going to allow you to bring other individuals out to the US at a pretty low, inexpensive cost point. And so as you grow and scale in the US, this was going to give you the best benefits. Sometimes it's a combination.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much for that. Final point, Kirsty, I just wanted to ask about sort of Perlego's plans. You mentioned that you just had a Series B bridge, and you did say that like for US investors probably weren't, in terms of expectations, looking at the same things that you were or had the same perspective that you did. Is it something that you guys would consider in the future? And like, are you considering putting boots on the ground at some point, given your current scale in the US?
Yeah, so kind of, as I said, particularly sort of on the B2B sales side, and I guess kind of similar to the experience Andy's having, that is a different beast as to kind of where we've scaled so far. And it is like the kind of the next natural step there is having sort of more of a physical US presence and kind of, you know, what we can do around that as well.
And do you see that as like, is there a lot of risk involved in that? Or do you need more data in order to make the call on how quickly you make that move?
with everything, like there's a slight element of kind of you do it and you build on what you learn. So you can, there's always a balance and a trade-off between sort of speed and having everything perfectly aligned. You can kind of shoot yourself in the foot by getting everything perfect and then taking a year to do anything. And I'd kind of always vote for you're better off making a couple mistakes as long as it's done with some appropriate guardrails in place, so you can always course correct as you go along.
Amazing. Thanks for that. And final thoughts from you, Anthony, before we open up for Q&A, if anybody would like to ask our expert panel anything.
I would say, you know, the reason we procrastinated is we put it into all these difficult things. And so my goal was to take all these difficult things and then find solutions for them. So here goes super easily, which is, you know, you're going to start probably fairly quickly. You make a Delaware C corporation, which is super easy, can help you on that. Then you want to hire people in the US. So there are companies like TriNet or Sequoia One that will hire, where you can hire people from your Delaware C corporation for a very small overhead, and they take care of all the payroll and taxes and the health benefits, because you can't hire people without health benefits, otherwise bad things happen to them and they won't work for you anyway. So those will help. Then for your US taxes for an early stage company, the companies like Inkle and Doula that will, for like $1,200 a year or something fairly inexpensive, do your taxes. And then of course, when you want to be there yourself, you're going to talk to Ellis Porter for your visa. Of course, Wise is there to help every time I go on the subway in New York and I tap on Apple Pay to pay. And I know that $2.90 is going to be $2.90, not $5 or something from our high street bank. So there are, you know, put together a group of companies that are modern platforms that you actually, and an article that says, as I've got a LinkedIn post on it, you can actually get started at modest cost with high confidence pretty easily.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, that's a
and one more thing, which is, you know, get global entry or TSA pre, so that when you arrive at JFK or SFO or whatever, instead of that giant line over there with all the plebeians, you can sail through with Face ID, and in less than a minute you're in.
And also, as we learned from Arvinder, do a bit of an audit of your social media before you go to customs. Very interesting. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you so much for listening this evening. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? Oh, we've got one over here. Hello, I recognize you from
He's difficult. Be careful with him. So.
Hello. Great panel. Really love the discussion. 2 questions. What's the difference between like setting up a Delaware C Corp or a Wyoming C Corp? And then the next question, also for Seedlegals, what is the impact or like, you know, impact on your SEIS if you decide to do a Delaware flip versus just having a separate Delaware entity and keeping your UK entity the same? Thanks.
Great questions. Once upon a time, you know, all equity-fueled startups would be incorporated in Delaware. If you're a cheese shop, you incorporate an LLC, a limited liability corporation, in whatever state you're in. But investors can't invest in an LLC. It needs to be a C corporation. There's no shares in an LLC. So you can have a C corp in many states. And Delaware ruled the roost until Elon began tweeting that he had investor problems in Delaware. And so he said, you should go elsewhere. But I want to give people the right advice. And when I ask investors and I ask lawyers, they all know Delaware, and nobody knows, you know, if you are into cattle rustling, then Wyoming is really good for lawyers. But for equity, you know, it just adds friction. So if you're a trillionaire and you've got some activist investors, you might consider your options. But if you're a startup founder, you just want your next investor discussion when they go, where are you incorporated? You go, Delaware, great. So what do you do? As opposed to, why Wyoming and so on. So Delaware is an easy choice. The other thing is the US states are hugely competitive and they copy each other or bring out new things. So when Elon tweeted about Delaware, they changed the law to remove the activist investor piece, and Wyoming and Texas are now copying Delaware law to eat their business. So it's quite fun. And it's really interesting, while the UK government is increasing capital gains tax and talking about exit taxes and making this more difficult and not wanting to pay R&D, the US states are fighting for your business. So there's a good lesson there. So the other thing is with SEIS. So the good news, what most people don't know, is you can create a Delaware company and still raise SEIS from UK investors. Or if you've got a UK company that's raised SEIS, you can preserve it when you do the Delaware flip. and we can help you with both of those on Seedlegals. And that, I think, by the way, in the future, it could be the new default. 12 months from now, just incorporate in Delaware, go raise from UK investors, and when you're ready, you've got more optionality for US fundraising.
Hope that answered your question. Brilliant. Any other questions? Yes, over here. Can see a few others. We'll come to you in a bit.
Thanks. Barney Smeaton. I work for New Jersey's Trade and Investment Agency.
They've got a big checkbook and they do co-investments. So be nice and find this person afterwards.
Thanks. I swear I didn't pay him to say that. Thank you. The question I have is for B2B businesses, how would you recommend they go about customer discovery in the US?
You would take them first.
We found it, again, quite an interesting experience. As I said, we have kind of the D2C side of the business, which we used as our point of entry. So actually, we sort of had the benefit, I guess, of a lot of qualitative data before we sort of built out the B2B side, which allowed us to kind of actually go in with a bit more of an insightful go-to-market of actually, we sort of already knew what the consumer was after, and that enabled us from the B2B perspective to actually tailor our approach a lot more. And so for us, kind of in terms of, building out that tailoring, it was really looking at, okay, well, how can we make this sort of stand out? Because the truth is what we found, at least in the US, was you're sort of spoilt for choice and options. And so it's quite hard to actually have a distinguishing factor when there are multiple versions of you in almost everything. It's not super probable that you are a completely unique offering. If you are, great, you probably don't need to do a ton of discovery. But actually, how could we sort of tailor that? And then given the scale and size of the market, actually start with kind of more targeted niche and segments rather than we're going to tackle the US, which is, I used to work for some company where we did sort of a portfolio FD, and a lot of people, it was, as you say, the big banana, and they just wanted to go to the US, but without really a plan in terms of like, where do you have the strongest product market fit? What is the niche that you can really excel in? And how do you align that to sort of what people are looking for? And so I think that kind of distinction between having sort of a more targeted approach versus just I'm entering the US, it comes back to the sort of intentionality we were talking about in terms of just the US in general.
I think, by the way, you've asked the most important question, because it's what's your go-to-market strategy in the US and how does it differ from the UK? So the first thing to note is there are lots of really great groups that you can join. There's one called GBX, which is GB people in mostly San Francisco, and we're members of that WhatsApp group, and they do in-person events. There are many, many WhatsApp groups. But that where you can ask these questions. But from one of these groups, I met for a beer, a UK founder in New York, and he was explaining that he first sent some sales team out to the US, and for the first year or two, they just burnt money, nothing worked. And then he got on a plane and he realized that their go-to-market was events. They sell to particular segments, so there are these massive trade events, and he now goes around the different 4 or 5 or 6 a year, and their business is booming. And it took him a while to realize that. So to understand what's your go-to-market. And the other thing is there's so much money from these enormous companies. People go, it's not worth selling for ticket sizes of less than $50,000 a year. It's just not worth it. Once our ticket size is more than 250K a year from these companies that are doing 50 to 100 million a year in revenue, then it's interesting. We'll get a salesperson. We'll get them in each state. That's like, okay, that's great. Nice if you can do that. But figuring out that go-to-market is, I think, key to your US or indeed UK expansion, although here it's easier because you just walk a mile from here and you've covered most of UK.
Yeah, it's the same for Wise. Go-to-market is always the first question we ask, even though we're live in many, many countries. Yeah, we've got a question over here. I think there was one back here. So we'll go here first, then there, and then there. Okay.
How is effective M&A as a plan?
Would anybody like to field that question?
I mean, it's a very broad question, and I guess you could apply that to kind of, I assume we're referring here specifically to kind of in the US. I I mean, again, there's from my perspective, there's pros and cons to sort of everywhere you go. With an M&A strategy, you are sort of, in some ways, skipping a lot of steps. But I think kind of the flip side to skipping a lot of steps by kind of almost purchasing yourself a fully fledged entity is just being really careful on the diligence of what it is exactly. And also back to that cultural side, the kind of biggest gaps I've seen is sort of the cultural misalignment and the sort of lack of appreciation for two, in theory, similar, same language, similar kind of vibe. You'd think there'd be more over that. But when it comes to ways of working, in particular, the work culture and how they do business is very different. And so actually, it's not just like a quick fix necessarily. It's kind of how do you then work with what you've acquired?
Yeah.
By the way, it's an interesting question. Were you thinking of buying a US company or selling your company to a US company? Both. Okay. All right. I think the problem with buying a US company is, I mean, it's, you can go to acquire.com and sites like that, and depending on, for a few $100,000 for small things. But the problem is valuations are higher in the US. And so it's troublingly difficult for a UK company based on UK VC valuations to go eat a much bigger fish. In terms of being acquired by a US company, that could be an interesting exit, of course, but now you have to figure out, does the US company want to buy you because they want to enter the UK or Europe and that's your gateway? Or, what's the reason for being purchased? And then go find and scratch that itch for that US company.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we have one over here. Yep.
Hello, yeah, thanks very much for the information so far. And just off the back of that question there, actually, no, I'll skip that one. So share options. So if you do a Delaware flip off the back of that and you want to, hire some employees over there, how do you go about structuring share options? Are they under the US entity, or how does that work?
Great question. So share options are always in the top company because subsidiaries have got no value. They're just 100% owned by the top company. So if you've got a UK top company, any share options you give people will be in your UK company, including folks in the US. If you do a Delaware flip, your Delaware company will be the top company. And that means if you've flipped, you've given EMI options to your UK team already, you have to reissue those options in the US company, probably do a new EMI valuation. It may be possible to preserve it, but either way, they'll either get newly issued options, but essentially backdated so that the equivalent vesting, or you may be able to preserve the original options, but they'll be reissued in the US company.
And follow up from tax implications for founders. So let's say I wanted to go and do a roadshow around the US as a founder, and then I wanted to stay there longer term. What are the kind of immediate tax implications, from a visa point of view for someone to want to do that?
I would speak to a tax advisor. No, I do immigration. That's a completely different beast. It can get complicated, and every state has its own requirements. So from an immigration perspective, going there using an ESTA or B1 is absolutely fine. And then your activities are really going to drive from what you would need to do from an immigration perspective. But tax and immigration typically come hand in hand. Typically, when you trigger a tax consequence, you're probably going to trigger an immigration consequence as well, because you're spending enough time there and your activities are such that you probably are working. But I wouldn't want to give any incorrect information about what may or may not happen if you travel around the US from a tax perspective.
We always have some tax partners that we might be able to refer you to. You can speak to my colleague Naomi over here about the tax and RSUs question. Given that we're in the neighborhood, we've got a question over here, and I'm aware that we have a few over here. So, we've got loads. They keep on coming. This is great. It means you guys are getting value out of this session.
Hi. Yeah, just to follow up on the equity question, and maybe pushing a little bit more. We were looking at potentially trying to separate the US and the UK as separate entities and trying to maintain that a little bit. Is that still possible to say, get someone into the US that is going to add a lot of value and have maybe quite a significant amount of equity there, whilst maintaining a completely separate EMI or equity structure in the UK? And as a separate question, just on bootstrapping, it feels like there's a lot of talk about investment. Is there still the same opportunity in the US to try and bootstrap, or is it just needing to go straight into investment as well?
Okay, great question. So on the first one, do you have a UK top company or a US top company or two completely independent companies with you owning both of them?
At the moment, we've just got a UK company, but we're
Okay.
looking at potentially creating a top co, and then that top co owning UK and
Okay.
US.
All right, so I think it's pretty simple, which is, firstly, sometimes people go, can I have a UK company and independently a US company, which basically means you own two companies, which is very nice for you, but not useful for investors because they have to bet on one. And it's no good if you're making money here and they put money in here and you own both. So there are only two stable solutions, which is a UK top company, Delaware subsidiary, or the other way around. And then the next thing is options are always in the top company. And there's no problem with making multiple option schemes, one of them for your UK employees and one for your US employees. In the UK, you get an EMI valuation. In the US, you get a 409A valuation, and they're providers for all of these. Some of them charge thousands and some are inexpensive. In my LinkedIn post, if you ping me, I can point you to one that does it inexpensively. So these are easy solutions. And then I forget part two of the question, which was... Oh, bootstrapping. I remember. You're right. So bootstrapping, the idea is once upon a time, you had to spend like £1 million on Cisco servers before you could build anything. And then AWS cloud hosting came along and you could give them a small amount of money per month, but you still had to spend hundreds of thousands on software developers. But now, thanks to Claude Code and Lovable, you can get rid of the software developers, and with just vibe coding yourself on a few weekends, you can build everything yourself. It's not quite true, but you don't need to raise as much. And so you can bootstrap for longer. And so bootstrapping is something that's sort of people are thinking about. The problem is the time to fundraise is where you've validated that people want your product, and your ability to fund it yourself is limiting the rate of growth. So you're going, if only I had another salesperson or a marketing person. It's no point spending another year of your life futzing around doing everything yourself when you could get there faster before someone else eats your lunch. So as soon as you've got some validation, then you probably want to raise investment. Until then, if you can do it on your own dime, that makes life easier. There's one more quick point, which is seed strapping. So people then call me and go, we just want to raise one round. That'll be enough. We never need to raise again because it's like so easy to build with AI. And I just think they're going to call me in 9 months' time for the next round, because one of two things happens. Either it takes longer to build and they need more money, or things are going really well, in which case they want to scale faster, so they need more money. But whichever it is, never tell your investors you're seed strapping, because you're basically telling them you're uninvestable for an investor, because you're saying you're not fundraising again, so they'll never be able to make a return on investment in the next round. And you're probably also telling you're building a hobby business with no particular exit in mind. So don't tell an investor that.
It's a really important insight. Just on the RSUs question, Kirsty, do you have share options for your employees?
Yes, but we're a UK top co, so we
Right.
have an EMI scheme, and then just due to the limited number of non-UK employees, we just have an unapproved share scheme for everyone else.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Cool. We had a couple more questions over here. I remember. Yes. In fact, I think over here you've been waiting, and then I'll come back into the middle. Yeah, I am. And I'm wearing heels. Amazing.
Hi, thank you again for doing this. I appreciate it. So I'm actually a founder of a US headquartered company that moved to London a couple of years ago. So it's interesting to hear this, but moved here. It was quite easy for me to choose London, moving this way across the pond. Much different on that side, in choosing locations. You talk about product market fit and test markets and your go-to-market strategy and so on. But how do you help, or what's your advice on choosing the right market for a UK company going that direction?
Which city are you from in the US?
Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay. That was.
But I've lived all abouts.
Do you want to go?
Sure, happy to. So the first thing I always ask our clients is, have you been to the US? And I'm surprised by how many people haven't, and they're trying to launch a business out there. So the first thing I say is jump on a flight, go to the East Coast, go to the West Coast, go north, go south, and just see what you like, right? Spend a bit of time there. I had one client who was adamant that they wanted to go to New York, had never been there, and I convinced him to take a flight to New York. And I said, I put him in contact with a office concierge person who helps with housing, and I said, just go and see what a one-bedroom apartment in New York costs. And he did. And he said, we pay our employees well. They would have to be 2 hours outside of the city to be able to afford being in New York. So in terms of where to go, one, it's, do you have a nexus between your clients or your products that drives you to a particular region? Secondly, if you're going because of, there's no drive from a client basis, you can be anywhere, does tax play a big factor? And normally it does for most people. They like to have a bit more money in their bank account. And so there's a lot of states that have zero income tax, state income tax. Weather could be another factor. The thing that people don't factor into is the time difference. If you're running a UK or European company and you have a team on the West Coast, that is brutal. You're a full business day behind or ahead of them. And so when you're trying to have phone calls with someone on the West Coast and it's 6 o'clock here and they're just waking up, or they're trying to contact you in the middle of the day because there's an issue and it's middle of the night here, that 3 hours difference between the East and West Coast is just a game changer. And I have clients on the East and West Coast, and the West Coast clients, whenever they ask for a phone call, you're going to be up late, right? And so you cancel dinner plans. So, but if you're trying to scale a business and grow a business, and you've got 2 feet, one in the UK, one in the US, that time difference is hard. Jumping on a flight, a 7-hour flight to New York is very different to an 11-hour flight to San Fran.
My logic, by the way, is should I be in the US at all? I can do everything on WhatsApp, on Zoom, and so on. But if I'm going to be in the US, it's going to be because I want to do in-person meetings. So for me, there's no point being in Raleigh. They've got very nice trees, but not a big startup scene. So you want to be somewhere where you can, like, in 30 minutes, be at every startup event. Otherwise, there's no point being there in person. And for me, that was either SF or New York, but everything I read about SF, I don't want to go there. And New York is easy to get to. I love New York. I think I now have a reputation of the crazy English guy that literally runs everywhere up and down Manhattan. So it takes me 30 minutes max to run anywhere in New York. And I really like it. And you can do 4 in-person events per day in New York if you've got nothing else to do with your time. They've got the most amazing startup scene. So for me, it's stacked up with New York. But for this other UK founder who's doing events around the country, maybe something that's closer, geographically to the center, although he's in Hell's Kitchen. So your mileage will differ based on, I think, where your target market is. And East Coast is going to make life much easier and your commute a lot more fun and less expensive.
Amazing. Thanks so much. A few questions in the middle here. Yep.
Quick question for Anthony. What do you do when you've got your Delaware C Corp, and to protect yourself from frivolous litigation, which the US is full of? Do you set up a subsidiary? And you guys must have gone through that, and you probably as well with Wise. Do you? Okay, fair enough. So rather than getting the C Corp, subject to litigation, do you set up a subsidiary to kind of build a barrier for protect the investors?
I totally don't know the answer. I'm fortunate that I haven't had to test that particular answer, but I follow a bunch of lawyers in the US, especially who tweet a lot about class action. They basically say as soon as you become popular, someone suing you is almost inevitable. When I talk to UK founders, and I talk to a lot, it's almost never the case that I've come across a founder involved in any litigation. And in the US, it's like, oh no, I need another 20K because I'm in litigation at the moment. It's like, dude, that's weird. So I don't think there is a particular answer, except
what about you
to
guys,
not live in
Kirsty?
the US and just shut the company.
Have you done anything about
I mean, touch wood, we haven't actually gone through it, but when we have signed kind of larger or more material contracts in the US. Kind of one of the two big things is one, having to review all of our insurance policies to account for kind of the much higher clauses that they have and ability to sue. And actually into most of the modeling we do, we actually build out an element of there is a reasonable probability something will be litigated, and so we need a provision for it is how we deal with it.
What do you find?
We don't really get into the weeds there, and it really is dependent on the company themselves and how big they get.
When things go wrong with him, they don't get sued, they just get extradited.
Yes. We'll find out.
It's different. Okay, and yeah, and on the wise point, we have a very big legal team. So yeah.
So I have a question for Arvinder on visas. We're in the process of doing our own US expansion, and I'm taking very much, I think, well, Anthony's approach when you said, you know, just get on planes and go and meet face to face and build your business that way to start with. At which point do you think that a standard ESTA with global entry and TSA pre, which I've got, it's no longer going to be sufficient? And my question is really about the definition of what it means to be actively working and running a business in the US. I'm obviously tied to the UK. I live here. My family is here. I do not intend to live and work in the US. Then, you know, I would say that the center of gravity of everything that we deliver is ex-UK, but the sales part of it is facing the US. So I want to be on planes. I want to spend maybe a week every month in front of clients. Do I need an E2 visa at this point in case I want to grow in the future? Am I okay just sticking with an ESTA at the time being? What would your advice be?
Great question, and one we get a lot of. So I always think immigration, particularly in the US, is great to look at short, mid, and long-term options. The immediate focus is going to be your short-term options. So for most individuals traveling from the UK, you're going to be eligible to use your ESTA under the visa waiver program. And so that will allow you to go into the US for up to 90 days per trip to engage in meetings, go to conferences, trade shows, pitch your products, talk to customers, set up bank accounts, all those types of things. Generally speaking, you need to be mindful of patterns of travel. Are you traveling to the US with a high degree of frequency? That could be you're going there every month and spending a couple of weeks, or are you spending long periods of time in the US? So are you going to the US and you're spending 50, 60, 70 days, coming back to the UK for a week or 2 weeks and heading back, and you're doing that? Those two patterns of travel are going to increase the scrutiny when you get to a flight, and officers will start to pick that up. Now, it could be your second, third, fourth trip. I've had some clients who have traveled to the US and spent 89 days left and done that for 2 years, and they've never been picked up. I've had others who have taken a second flight to the US ever, and they're questioned for 2 hours at immigration. And it just depends on the officer you get. There is a huge amount of discretion. It just takes one officer who's had an argument with their spouse in the morning to pick on everyone coming through that day. One of the key things I do always advise clients is 90% of the individuals I speak to about these short-term options traveling on an ESTA, they will inevitably have a friend who has moved to the US on a B1 visitor visa, and that gives them the right to work. That is complete nonsense. It doesn't. Those friends are incorrect. And I always analogize it to this. I drive on the motorway, and sometimes I may or may not go above 70 miles an hour. The fact that I haven't been caught doesn't make the speed limit 80 miles an hour. It just means I haven't been caught. And so I don't recommend actually that people try and apply for a B1 visa if you have an ESTA. They are the exact same thing. They allow you to do the same thing, activities in the US. The only distinction is that for individuals who have a B1 visa, they can stay in the US for up to 90 days. They cannot engage in any additional activities. But the scrutiny, particularly at the US Embassy in London right now, if you're trying to make an argument that you need to be in the US for longer than 90 days, the officers in London will instantly think you're trying to work there. because they don't understand why you need to go to the US for meetings, conferences, or trade shows for more than 90 days per trip. And so we get that question a lot, and I've had phone calls pretty much every week where individuals have said, I've been advised to get a B1 from another law firm. The B1 was refused. When you have a visa refusal, regardless of the reason why it was refused, your ESTA is automatically invalidated indefinitely. And you get into this really vicious cycle where you've had a visa refusal, your ESTA is refused. Good luck trying to go back to the US Embassy within 12 months and get a visitor visa. It's not going to happen. So who's doing that? And like I said, I get that question a lot. And everyone's got a friend in the US who's got a B1 and is living there, working there, and they're not working legally.
I think the one thing to add is, I've had great experiences from the nice people at JFK customers, but you never know when you're going to get someone else. But to have your story prepared that you're there for some startup event, or you're going to South by Southwest, or an exhibition or something like that. So you've got an anchor point for being there that is the legit thing. And definitely, I saw some person tweeting that she went to join her boyfriend and she had a whole painting set, and then it was you're going to do artwork and sell artwork, and she was refused. So find the genuine, I'm doing this event and I'm meeting some customers and I'm having fun in New York.
Just one last thought on that. So I know you mentioned when are the bookends of when you should look to apply. Frequency of travel and patterns of travel is one indicator, and then your activities are the second big indicator. Have you started to build a team? Are you starting to actively manage that team in the US? Are you doing more than just product demonstrations? Are you now customizing that product for your particular clients? Are you spending your time developing your product there? Those are those types of activities where you're probably in that gray area and need a work permit, and you want to think about that work permit in this climate, probably 8 to 9 months, if not more, before you get to that point where you're there.